Hi, everyone. This is the Crime Cafe, your podcasting source of great crime, suspense, and thriller writing. I'm your host, Debbi Mack. And before I bring on my guest, may I remind you, like you have a choice, that the Crime Cafe 9-book set and Crime Cafe short story anthology are available for sale on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Apple, etc., etc. You can find the buy links on my website, debbimack.com. And also, we have a Patreon campaign. If you make a $10 monthly donation, you will get access to a lot of really great content, short stories, and a free copy of our Crime Cafe 9-book set. That's 9 novels for free. So consider it, please. And you'll get our endless gratitude as well. Okay, having said that, it's my pleasure to introduce my guest, a Mississippi native, a Marine, a journalist, and speechwriter, as well as the author of 4 novels, Phillip Thompson. Hi, Phillip. It's great to have you on. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Debbie. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure thing. There is so much I could ask you because you've done so many fascinating things, but let's talk about your crime writing.
Okay.
Your first novel was Enemy Within. Tell us about the story and that protagonist.
Sure. That novel seems completely old now. I wrote it in the late 90s. And the protagonist is a ATF agent named Wade Stewart, who's investigating a white militia who is plotting to overthrow the governor of the state of Mississippi, and also has a gun smuggling operation going. And Stewart, who is investigating this, kind of runs into a moral, not a moral dilemma, but he starts to challenge his own thinking about the government that he works for, the government that he served, and how that clashes with individual freedoms. And when I wrote it at the time, it was precipitated by something that, an incident that I ran across when I was on active duty, and it made me start to think about, what would really happen if, Americans were confronted with individual freedoms, especially with gun rights. And this goes back, 20 years. Back then, it sort of seemed implausible, if you will. But 20 years later, it seems a little bit more relevant now than it did even back then.
Yes, absolutely. It seems like a very timely issue.
I thought it was then. It wasn't so much then, but I think, years later.
You were ahead of your time.
Apparently it was, yeah.
Well, I think that's a very intriguing premise, and I actually bought a copy of the story.
Oh, okay.
So I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thanks.
Definitely. On your blog, you mentioned that you tried to turn it into a screenplay, or did you turn it into a screenplay?
Well, I have a draft. I'm not necessarily a screenwriter. I did teach myself how to write screenplays a few years ago, and I had this grand idea. I'll just turn my first novel into a screenplay, which is a lot harder than it sounds. It's a completely different form. Screenwriting is. You got 120 pages, and there are rules that you need to comply with. So I have a draft, but it's very rough, and I don't think it's quite ready for prime time yet.
My sympathies are with you. I know what it's like to try to adapt one's own novel because I've done it.
Right, you're a screenwriter yourself.
It's very, very tough, and I didn't think I was going to be able to do it, actually. The person who asked me, the producer, said, I think you can, go right ahead. And I'm like, okay. It's tough. It's really, really tough. Now you have a second book with that protagonist. Tell us a little about that. The ATF agent left the agency and goes to Oahu?
He did, yes. That's the setup of the story. the way the first novel ended, he had resigned from the ATF and just decided to go to Hawaii, and get away from his former life and just sort of take some time off, and got a job, well, sort of a job, freelancing for the newspaper there on Oahu. And in the process of that, comes across yet another homegrown domestic terrorist problem, which that novel concerned itself with the Hawaiian sovereignty movement that has been going on out in Hawaii. Now, let me be very clear here. It was fiction. It was a novel. Nobody on Oahu, as far as I know, is contemplating that kind of thing. But I took the idea of, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement as compared to the United States of America. I used to live in Hawaii. I was there for 4 years. When I lived there, I couldn't help but be absorbed by the culture, studied it, and came to realize that, hey, there is an issue here with the way that Hawaii became a state. And most of us today don't even remember or don't realize how that happened. Hawaii was a separate governing kingdom at one point, and then it was annexed by the United States through a series of political and cultural events that happened. And there's still a lot of resentment, within some of the Hawaiian culture toward the United States. So I took all of that and said, okay, what would happen if somebody was murdered aboard a Marine Corps base? That's a United States federal property. And then you take that and you throw in the politics of a sovereignty movement, and then what happens? And during the process of investigating this murder and trying to find out what happened, Wade finds himself, being a former Marine himself, being a man who believes in justice for all people. All these different moralities start to clash for him. And he's aided in his investigation by a woman an ATF agent who was sent from DC to basically clamp him down. They realize that we've got this former agent out there who caused us problems before, and now he's doing it again. So they send a hotshot out to Hawaii to kind of keep an eye on him, and she starts to see his point of view as well. And in the end, they stopped the plot. And that book, I actually self-published that book because I'd written it, and I was working with an agent in New York, and she liked it, and we were working back and forth with it. But then September the 11th happened. And there's a scene in that book, it's called A Simple Murder. There's a scene in that book that after September the 11th, she and I both agreed, nobody wants to read this, nobody wants to touch it. So I just laid the book down for about 6 years, and I didn't do anything with it. And so then eventually I published it myself. But that book to me is important because that was the last book that I wrote with Wade Stewart as a protagonist, but it was the first one with Molly McDonough, who ends up kind of jumping universes into my last two novels.
Yes. Wow, you really have me intrigued. I've got to read all these books now. Oh, definitely. I mean, your work sounds fascinating. All the stuff with jurisdictional issues and sovereignty, that kind of, resonates with me as a lawyer, not to mention as a crime writer.
Right.
Yeah. That kind of stuff really is intriguing. So one of your characters in that book has been transplanted over into the series with Cold Harper.
Correct.
Does she appear in the first book in that series?
No, she doesn't. She shows up in the second one and the one that I'm writing now. And I have these characters that, as you know, they stay in your head a long time. And I wrote the first Cold Harper novel, Deep Blood, which is kind of and I wanted a new universe. Because I started out writing 25 years ago, thinking that, I can write these kind of, male thriller type novels that, guys like. And I was able to write them, but the whole time it didn't quite resonate exactly the way I wanted to. And, I took some time off from writing and went into a creative writing class down here at the community college to learn to craft a little bit more, to just sort of, okay, just to stop trying to create this stuff and let's learn some craft and hone that craft. And what I did, one of the authors that I was reading at the time was Larry Brown, who's a native Mississippian and just an unbelievable writer, or was anyway. Unfortunately, he's passed. And he reading his work fundamentally changed the way I approach writing. So I said, I want to write this kind of Southern fiction, but I like crime. So I'm always going to be a crime writer. So I went back to that. So the first Colt Harper novel was Deep Blood, which is a character study as well as, as much as it is a crime fiction novel. The publisher kind of called it redneck noir when he read it, and I kind of liked that phrase and kind of stuck with it. That's kind of the way I see my writing. But the first one was Deep Blood, and that's where I introduced Colt Harper and a new cast of characters that just would not leave me alone. So I wrote the second one, which is Outside the Law. That's the one that's out now. That one was published by Brash Books.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned redneck noir. Have you ever read Daniel Woodrell?
I know the name and I've seen his books, but I've not picked him up yet.
You should. Tomato Red is the one I've read by him, and I really loved it. And I think it definitely qualifies.
All right.
I think you'd enjoy it.
Right.
Joe Lansdale?
Yeah. I've read some of his.
I love his work.
Yeah, very good. And kind of, right in those lanes of what I try to do. Keep it local, and keep it, gritty. Grant Jerkins is another one that does a great job with that. Tom Franklin's got a couple of books that I would put in that category. Steve Yarborough, when I read Oxygen Man by Steve Yarborough, I thought that was just brilliant because it was very local. There were probably 3 or 4 characters, and it was gritty, and it was real. The characters were all real, but they didn't lose. None of them, lost their dignity. They were hard scrap people, but they didn't come across as a stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you like William Faulkner? Speaking of Southern writers.
Well, this is the part where I have to say, because I'm from Mississippi, of course I like William Faulkner. Yeah, I've read a lot of his stuff, but it's very difficult for me to sit down and read a Faulkner novel. I do like I've always loved reading his short stories, and learned a lot from reading that. That was kind of, William Faulkner was kind of thrown at me when I went to Breadloaf a few years ago, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and I took a short story that eventually became the novel Deep Blood. But as I was getting critiqued at Breadloaf, one of my instructors just happened to be Tom Franklin, who at the time was the writer in residence at Ole Miss. So I go all the way to Vermont thinking I'm going to be unique with this Southern story, and I get thus the Southern story writer. I kind of, you got to be kidding me, really? I can't get one break here. But he suggested that, you ought to take this short story and then go back and read William Faulkner. I'm like, seriously, do I have to read William Faulkner? But yeah, I can't say that I'm terribly influenced by his writing because it's just so damn difficult. But yeah, I do enjoy his short stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think anybody who can write short stories amazes me. I mean, I've done a few, and I'm always amazed when they manage to pull it off.
Yeah, I would rather just honestly sit down and write a novel.
You have more room.
If he had more time, he'd write short stories, which is kind of how I feel about it.
Exactly right. Let's see. Where do you picture going with your current series? Do you see it going to a 3rd or 4th book?
I'm currently writing the 3rd. I'm almost finished with the first edit of it. So yeah, when when I finished Outside the Law, I kind of left it open-ended intentionally, not because necessarily I knew I was going to write another one, the third one, but I left it open-ended because I wasn't really sure what was going to happen with the characters. When I took my hands off the keyboard and said, okay, that one's done, just want to take a step back and see if Colt and John and Rhonda and everybody else, if they leave me alone, or if they come back and say, hey, I got some more stuff to talk about. It turns out they did. So I'm writing that one now. But yeah, I'm not done with the characters yet. I kind of like putting these guys in situations and then seeing what happens to them and see how they react to it. So I think I've still got a few more things to say with them.
That's excellent. Yeah, because it's definitely, I like the book a lot. I'm reading your second now and enjoying it very much.
Thanks.
Where do you see Molly going, just out of curiosity? Because she's such an interesting character.
Everybody always asks about Molly. Well, she shows up. I don't want to give too much away, but she does come back in the one that I'm writing now. The working title is Dangerous Conceits. I don't know if that will survive the publishing process or the editing process, but that's the working title. And yeah, she comes back. And she has been kind of interesting to me. It's very hard for me to write a female character. Kind of hard to get into a female's head as far as for me, obviously. But I've enjoyed, putting Molly in a situation and seeing what happens to her. I didn't want to, there's right now, I think anyway, there's a trend, especially on TV and in the movies, to have either, a female protagonist with a gun or a female sidekick. Well, it goes back as far as the X-Files with Mulder and Scully, but you got, you watch Longmire and he's got a female deputy, and you watch some of the other TV, or Broadchurch, the great BBC series. It's a man and a woman, and a lot of the shows are a man and a woman. But I wanted Molly to have her own identity, and I hope I've done that. I didn't want her to be restricted to somebody else's identity.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that you're looking to create a strong, independent woman and one who is actually a person, as opposed to just kind of an addition.
Right.
To the protagonist's life. Yeah.
Right. More than a sidekick.
More than a sidekick, exactly. And that's what they're looking for these days. I mean, in terms of like motion pictures anyway, and television.
Right.
But it never hurts in books either. You've also written a book called Into the Storm. That was based on your experiences as a soldier?
As a Marine, yes.
As a Marine.
A nonfiction book that I wrote when probably within a couple of years after coming back from Desert Storm.
And was it entirely based on your journals?
Yeah, it was. Of course, I kept a journal in college for a few years while I was in the Marine Corps. And I'd stopped because I was at school for almost a year in Oklahoma. When we found out that we were going to deploy to Saudi Arabia, though, I grabbed a notebook and started just scribbling down notes. And I ended up keeping that with me in my cargo pocket the whole 8 months that I was gone. I just took notes every day. And a lot of times it was just to vent some anger, or just to kind of keep up with stuff so that I could remember it, whenever I looked back at it again. And when I got home, I had 3 notebooks full of notes and maps that I'd drawn, just, all kinds of stuff that you keep up with when you have a lot of time sitting around with nothing to do but write. And at the time I noticed that there were a lot of coffee table books out about the war, big pictures and airplanes and bombs and things like that, but nobody had really written anything that accounted for just the individual guy on the ground. So I wrote it wasn't a complete replication of my journals. I took selected entries and I kind of put some context behind them. So you'd read the entry and then you'd read the context behind it. and put that all together, and Farland and Company down in North Carolina decided to publish it.
Well, that's fantastic. And I absolutely have to read it because stuff like that really intrigues me. And I think really everybody should read things like that to get an understanding of what it's like to actually go through those kinds of experiences.
Right. And that was the real reason I wrote it, because of course I obviously missed it all because I was there. But when I came home, I'd seen that most people thought they knew everything about it, had seen everything about it because it was all on CNN, which still a relatively new way to get your news in a 24-hour news cycle back in 1990. And I kept running into people who said, "Oh yeah, we saw that all on TV." Well, you saw what the media showed you, and the media showed you what the military let them. And underneath all that were these individual stories of guys who were just trying to get through another day out there in the desert.
Yes, the story that you don't see on the news.
Right, exactly.
The personal story.
Right.
And that's very important. I think that's about it then. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, not really. I mean, I always love to get a chance to talk with another writer about writing, so I appreciate the chance to come on the podcast.
The same here.
Just keep reading, keep writing.
Well, thank you. And you do the same.
Thanks, will do.
Awesome. Well, it was great having you on, and I'm so happy you could be here. And to all my listeners, I'd just like to say thank you for listening, and check out the Crime Cafe publications on my website, debbimack.com, and consider supporting the Patreon campaign, where you can get access to all sorts of new free content. And with that, I will simply say thanks again and talk to you in 2 weeks.